Hi, everybody. What I was planning to do is go over all of the lessons that I had assigned to you. And so I'll just kind of take it through as a lesson. Our first lesson was, how did America become a world power? And when we left off before our big break, we talked about the Spanish-American War. The United States fought over the island of Cuba. And at the end of that war, we had tremendous influence over Cuba, and we had also gained colonies of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. And so the United States that was a turning point for the United States because we were now kind of an imperial power. And so this first lesson kind of looks at how our attitude changed over the years. So we have these different policies, and I kind of numbered them. We start off with George Washington's isolationism and neutrality at number one. And then we looked outward to try to gain control of the North American continent with Manifest Destiny. And while we were just kind of growing up, we issued the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. And then we still wanted to expand further with the idea of manifest destiny, so we could put in expansionism here, and that kind of led us into the Mexican-American War, where we got the rest of Texas and the Southwest up to California. And then as we became more of an industrialized nation, there was a need to imperialize, so we could move there to imperialism, and that took us into the Spanish-American War. And then as we became more of a world power, we got dragged into World War I. And then at the end of that war, many people felt like that was a mistake getting involved, and we wanted to return to isolationism. And so that's why I put a 9 there. And we see that with President Harding. He kind of promised a return to normalcy, which meant isolationism and neutrality, as well as laissez-faire economics. And we'll talk about that later. Okay, and then for this part, I had asked you to identify the different spots on the map. And of course, there's a color version of this map here, so you could have used that one to do it. And I'll just fill in here. We have Wake Island at number 3, the Philippines at 5, Hawaii is 1, Midway is 2, Cuba 7, Canal Zone 9, Puerto Rico is 8, Guam 4, Samoa is 6. Okay, and then we have the color version, as I mentioned. And then I had just put up some notes about how the United States, well, here are some pictures first, how the building of the Panama Canal, everybody knew that this was going to happen and that it was going to save days and days of travel. And so it was very important to have control over the Panama Canal for the United States, because we wouldn't want, let's say, Germany to have control over the Panama Canal, because they could potentially cut us off, and that would interfere with American trade. And as we became this post-industrialized nation, trade became an essential part of our foreign policy. Here's just a picture of the canal, which was an engineering feat. And then I just kind of laid out some of the notes, how we got these different places, like Hawaii. American businessmen kind of were interested in allowing Hawaiian sugar to come into the country without being subject to an American tariff. So we overthrew the Hawaiian Queen in the name of American sugar interests. And then eventually Hawaii became a state in 1959, a long way down the road. The Panama Canal, which is something that the United States wanted to have control over, as I mentioned, and it was the area where it was going to be built was controlled by Colombia, and Colombia refused to give the United States permission to build the canal. And so the United States encouraged Panamanians who lived in Colombia to revolt and make their own country. And once Panama became an independent country, the United States negotiated a treaty with Panama to have a 99-year lease on that land. And then in 1977, the United States agreed to return the canal when it was due in 1999, and they actually followed through with it. So that was something that we promised to do, and we did later on down the road. Then in China, we had the open door policy, which was when the European powers had created spheres of influence in Chinese ports where they could control trade. And so what that meant is that each of these powers controlled a city, and they controlled the trade, and they would collect tariffs from people trading there. And they kind of were limiting the sovereignty of China and limiting trade in China for everybody. So the United States requested that China be open to all trade. And the European powers and Japan were not really interested in opening up China because they had established their spheres of influence, and why would they give that up? It just doesn't make sense. So they said no. And the Boxers rebelled in China. Those were people living inside of China who were resentful that the foreigners were carving up their nation. But the United States and these other nations put down the rebellion, and the United States gained some access to trade in China. So overall, the open door policy was only partially successful, but the importance of it is that it indicated that economic interests were going to shape our foreign policy from this point forward. Oops, misspelled that one. Going forward. Okay, period. So we can add that into our notes. And then I had just asked you to look at some of these pictures, these cartoons, and we see Uncle Sam saying, "Don't step on my feet, boys," to the little nations of Latin America, Honduras and Nicaragua, and so they're smaller. And this is kind of a racist portrayal of these people. We notice that, and we know this is like Teddy Roosevelt represented here with the teddy bear. And it kind of shows that America is just kind of doing what it wants in this area. And this picture we had looked at before our break, where the United States was now kind of taking over the world and spreading its wings and taking these other places under its wing. And this picture, of course, depicts China being carved up by the different European powers, and the Chinese people saying stop. Okay, and that kind of wraps up that lesson. So I'm just going to minimize that, and we're going to go on to this lesson, which is how did U.S. foreign policy change towards Latin America? And in this Do Now, we have our cartoon here that says civilization begins at home. And this is President McKinley looking out over the Philippines. And this is Lady Liberty representing the United States, and she's holding the scales of justice. And it says justice on her staff here. And she's pulling back the curtain to reveal a lynching in the background. And a lot of people kind of just, it looks like they're working or dying on the ground here. And so she's kind of saying to President McKinley that we're not really capable of going out and civilizing other places when we have all these problems at home. And President McKinley would just likely ignore her because he was very interested in expanding business. Remember that he was the president during the Spanish-American War and was willing to go to war to quote-unquote liberate Cuba from Spain. But of course, that was certainly in the financial interests and the business interests of the United States. So he would just basically ignore her. Okay, and then we're summarizing our Latin American policies here. And so if you were unclear as to the meanings of these policies, these are kind of simplified definitions that you could look at. So the Monroe Doctrine is going to match up with C. Why didn't that work? It did. Let me undo that. put a C here. That's what I wanted to do. The Roosevelt corollary is going to match it with D, and I'm going to talk more about that in a second. Dollar diplomacy is A, and missionary diplomacy is B. Okay, and so let's talk about these policies for a second. We start off with the Monroe Doctrine, that America will not get involved in European affairs. Any interference by Europe in the Western Hemisphere will be viewed as a threat to the United States. And this was issued way back in 1823, when the United States really didn't have the military power to support such a statement, but they made the statement anyway. And now in 1900, the United States is a much more powerful nation. This is after industrialization, after the Civil War, when our military was built up, and of course in the 1890s, when it was built up even more, the United States added on to this. And this is a nice definition of what the Roosevelt corollary was, that the United States is going to act as a police power in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, so they use that term a lot on the Regents exam, this police power. If you see that, you're going to think Roosevelt corollary. To maintain economic and political stability in Latin America. This will prevent these countries from appearing ripe for takeover by any European country, an action that would violate the Monroe Doctrine. And so what this meant is that the United States is going to take over the debts owed by Latin American countries to European countries. So now they're going to owe the money to the United States, and so we can control their economy and control their politics a little bit more. Okay, so this is kind of significant that we're going to take over their debts. And this way they'll owe us instead of owing Europe. And that's kind of a key to understanding that. And then after Roosevelt was no longer president, we have Taft's dollar diplomacy, which is the idea that we're going to try to allow American businesses to invest in Latin America. So we're going to be able to extend our influence over their economy as well as their politics. And then when Wilson became president, remember, he's this guy he's very religious, he's very moral. Sometimes this is referred to as moral diplomacy. He doesn't believe that it's appropriate to just go in and take over other places and not respect their rights. So he wants to back off from more of this imperialist attitude. So he says that America should treat Latin Americans with respect rather than taking their property by force. This can be accomplished by maintaining trade and economic influence. So he's still interested in influencing these areas. He's not stepping back so much from American influence, but he just wants to do it in a more respectful manner. Okay, and then we see some cartoons to look at that Teddy Roosevelt is dressed as a policeman, and this, of course, refers to the Roosevelt corollary. That the U.S. will keep order in Latin America. Okay, now let's go on to this one. Okay, so this cartoon I would suspect that you would have some difficulty with because we didn't go over some of these terms, so I'm going to explain it to you now. Okay, so what do the boats labeled debt collector, sheriff, and receiver have in common? What a receiver is when somebody files bankruptcy, they put all their money into a pot, and then somebody named a receiver takes over the pot and they distribute the money as best they can. Okay, and so when we say the United States is acting as a receiver, it goes back to this idea that the United States is going to take over the debts of these Latin American nations so that they owe us the money and we're in control. Okay, so the boats labeled debt collector, sheriff, and receiver all show that the United States will take over the economies of Latin American nations to make sure they are stable. Okay, so Europe will not be interested in taking them over. Okay, so I'm not really sure why these all got capitalized here, so if we could just ignore those capitalizations and think of this as one sentence, that would be fabulous. All right, so how does this policy differ from the earlier Monroe Doctrine? Well, the United States is actually getting involved in these Latin American nations to prevent a European takeover. Okay, so this is, in the Monroe Doctrine, we just kind of warned Europe to stay out. Now we're actually taking a role. So this kind of allows the United States to act as a police power. Okay, and sometimes this policy is referred to as the big stick policy. So speak softly and carry a big stick, which is the idea behind this. And then dollar diplomacy says we're going to allow American businesses to invest, and we'll also control the economies of these nations through American investment. Okay. And so a Venezuelan cartoonist might not really appreciate this idea. So if you look at this cartoon, we see Teddy Roosevelt coming in. He looks powerful, and he's just kind of marching in to take over the place, and it doesn't really show the negative impact. So a Venezuelan cartoonist might show the people of Venezuela being intimidated by this, and they might show the people looking at Teddy Roosevelt in an unfavorable light. Okay, and then let's go back to our aim here. How did U.S. foreign policy change towards Latin America? Well, once we got this taste of imperialism, then we kind of started exerting our power in Latin America, and we decided to take more of an active role in influencing the countries of Latin America here. And remember, Latin America is from Mexico south. And so we felt that we had the right to kind of go and police these areas and make sure they were stable so that Europe would no longer look at them as a place to be possibly recolonized. Okay, and that wraps up that lesson, so I'm going to minimize that, and I'll just move this map out of the way. We kind of talked about these policies, so I'm not going to do that again. And we're not here. I think we're moving on here. So then we go on to the day where you guys learned about how World War I began in Europe. Okay, and so remember that the world went to war in 1914 in Europe, but the United States did not get involved until 1917. And that's significant because there are two different reasons why the war happened versus why the United States got involved. Okay, so this day looked at what was going on in Europe. Okay, so let's talk about what happened here. That we have these underlying forces developing in Europe, largely as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, and so let's start with economic conflicts here. That the Industrial Revolution and economy led to competition for resources, and nations felt entitled to take over and imperialize other places to feed their industrial economy. So let's put that in. Ooh, that was bad. Industrial Revolution. Okay, and so then we'll go back to this nationalism, which led to the sense of entitlement. And so nationalism in general means loyalty to one's nation and culture. And in this case, we're talking about a feeling of superiority and a sense of entitlement to take land from others. So these things kind of go hand in hand. And then we see this buildup of the military, new weapons, and this gave countries a sense of power and invincibility, like they couldn't be hurt. I definitely messed that one up. Oh, I fixed it. Okay. And then the fact that they had alliances felt that, people made decisions based upon having backup. And so they kind of made foolhardy decisions or rash decisions because they felt that they had a whole team behind them. Okay, so these are the underlying factors. And then we have the spark, of course, which is the assassination of the Archduke and his wife. Okay, so we have Gavrilo Princip, who was a member of this group known as the Black Hand. Okay, so he was hoping to, he wanted Bosnia to belong to Serbia rather than Austria-Hungary. And so one thing led to another. So Austria-Hungary blames Serbia for the murders. Now, really, this is a criminal and a criminal organization acting to assassinate the Archduke. It wasn't the country of Serbia, but Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia. Okay, and so if we're looking for who was to blame, well, Austria-Hungary did not have to take this approach, but they did. So we could blame them for that. And so let's type that in. Okay, and so then let's take a look at Germany and see what they had to say. They backed Austria-Hungary. and they attacked Belgium. To get to France. Okay, we're going to look at the map there. Let's take a look at this map here. Okay, this is not such a great map, but we have Germany going west to attack Belgium rather than dealing with where Austria-Hungary was to the east. So they kind of escalated the fighting by going west and attacking Belgium. All right, let's talk about what Russia did. They were allies with Serbia, and they backed Serbia. And they started mobilizing their forces. Okay. Move that over. Perfect. Okay, and what about France? France was kind of defending itself here after Germany kind of went after them. That's not what I wanted to do. They aided Russia, and then Britain, what did they do? They declared war on Germany. So normally if we were in class, I would ask you to decide who was most to blame, and you would make your decision for that. So I want you to think about that. Usually we get the tie between Austria-Hungary and Germany, but as we know in the Treaty of Versailles that Germany does get blamed because most people see this attack on Belgium as, just really escalating the fight and bringing people in that didn't have to get involved. So that's pretty much why Germany was blamed for this. And as you know, the United States came in eventually on the side of Russia, France, and Britain. And Germany and Austria-Hungary became known as the Central Powers. And these people were called the Allies. Okay, moving on. Okay, so I just kind of asked you to identify where the fronts were. Here, we've got the Western Front in this spot over here. Right here, this is the Western Front. And then we have the Southern Front here. Actually, that's not true. The Southern Front is here, this spot here on the east side of Italy. And the Eastern Front was all along here. Okay. Oh, now we can see a better map when Germany attacked Belgium here for no reason when the fighting was really started here. Okay, and then this last page we looked at some of the new weapons that were involved. And you can see that one of the questions here, how is this different from earlier wars? Well, first of all, we have new weapons, we have fighting all over the world, but this is kind of like an industrialized war because you have these machine guns and tanks and airplanes. So this is really a post-industrialized war with these new weapons. So let's put some of that in and we'll wrap up this conversation. We've got new weapons, air, sea, trench fighting, bioweapons with the mustard gas, and it's fighting all over the world. Okay, so now let's go back to our aim. How did World War I begin? Well, in the post-industrialized world, there was a lot of competition among European powers, and coupled with this sense of nationalism, countries felt entitled to take over other places. And because they had new weapons, they had the sense of power and invisibility. And the fact that they had these secret alliances that nations felt like they could act and they would have backup. And once the assassination took place, the nations were just ready to fight because they were so hyped up due to this sense of economic competition and nationalism. And that led to fighting. And the fighting went on for years with this trench warfare, nobody gaining ground. Okay, so for 4 years, it says here, neither side advanced. So just killing and killing and killing for 4 years without making progress. Okay, and so the United States is sitting on the sidelines, watching, waiting, hoping to not get involved, but eventually they have to, or they feel they have to. And so that's the subject of our next lesson. So I'm going to close that, and let's look at this. I don't want to do the home front yet. Did I not pull that up? Darn it, I didn't pull that up. All right, so I'm going to get that document for us. Open. This is it. Okay, I'm going to make that a little bigger. Here we are. All right, so why did the United States get involved? There are a number of reasons. And so normally what I would do in this lesson is I would ask you, I would assign you one of these questions and ask you to examine it and come up with some reasons why the United States got involved and then rank them. Okay, so first of all, was it a threat to freedom of the seas? And so let's talk about what happened here. First of all, Germany announced that they would attack any ship in the area without warning. And what was new about this is that they were using submarines. Okay. And these submarines are also called U-boats, just to be a heads up on that. And what was different about this is that these U-boats had the benefit of surprise. So it would launch an underwater torpedo and destroy enemy ships. Okay, and normally what had happened in warfare is that a ship would be surrounded and taken over, and the people on board would be taken off and held captive. Okay, but with a submarine, you don't do that. You just destroy the ship. So this was seen as something particularly barbaric and uncivilized. And so then I asked you, if you were president of the United States, would you prohibit Americans from traveling? And most of you said yes. And the reason for that, of course, is because you wouldn't want to give Americans an excuse to go to war, because if people got killed, it might drag the United States in. But there is also an argument to say no. And that argument would be that if we allow Germany to tell us where we can send our ships, then they're basically in control of us, and we can't just hand over control of the seas to Germany. So let's say something to that effect. It would give Germany too much power over the United States. Okay, and so then the famous sinking of the Lusitania took place, and the reason is the Germans justified sinking, saying that they had guns, and they probably did. Okay, so that's our answer right there. But this wasn't the only ship that was destroyed. There were other ships like the Arabic and the Sussex. These were two other ships that were destroyed with Americans on them. And after the sinking of the Sussex, Germany promised to hold off on attacking ships. And so this is known as the Sussex Pledge. Okay, eventually they went back on this promise in April of 1917, which is a factor in us getting involved. Okay, so let's put that in. Okay, and then we move on to our second question here. Was it because of a threat to national security? And then we have the Zimmerman Note, which Germany proposed to Mexico that they should attack the United States to regain land that we got from the Mexican-American War back in 1848. Okay, so that was an offensive step made by Germany. Okay, and so this next point says that it's not just about Mexico, but if Germany attacks and takes over Britain and France and then has mastery of the Atlantic Ocean, then this is going to create a new situation in world politics, and that's going to threaten the United States. So that's something that we can add. So this threat to national security was not just about the Zimmerman Note, but we wouldn't want Germany to take over our trading partners and control the Atlantic. Okay, moving on. Was it due to economic interest? Did we get involved in World War I due to economic interest? A lot of people say that, saying we're going to war upon command of gold. And in the end, American sentiment favored the Allies because our bankers had loaned $2.3 billion to the Allies at this point. And we had loaned 27 million to the Central Powers. So we needed to see that money back. Many types of businesses stood to benefit from the war. So let's just kind of list them here. We have weapons manufacturers, of course. Stockbrokers, bond dealers, news agencies, all stood to profit from the war, and so people objected. Well, some people objected. Okay, then was it due to Allied propaganda? The news that we were getting came from Britain. Okay, so it made the British people look like heroes, and the Germans look like villains. Okay, and then this last comment is something that they usually ask about in the Regents exam, so you want to make sure that you know this: to defend democracy. Okay, so please note that. And this is from Wilson's speech when he asked Congress for a declaration of war. Okay, and remember that Congress has the power to declare war. That's in the Constitution. And so he had to go to the Senate and the Congress as a whole and ask them. And he says we need to protect democracy. And so at this point in the war, let's think about who was fighting. The Allies consisted of Russia, Great Britain, and France. And so we have two democratic countries here, and let's talk about Russia for a second. And we're going to make a little timeline for Russia. In March of 1917, we have something called the Russian Revolution, where they deposed the Tsar. So they got rid of the Tsar and established a provisional government based upon democracy. This didn't last that long, but while this happened, this is when the United States got involved. Okay, so at the same time, we see Germany resuming unrestricted submarine warfare. So the United States joins now. So now at this point, we are joining with Russia, a new democracy, Great Britain and France, also democratic nations. Who are we fighting? We are fighting imperial powers to support democratic nations against imperial powers. Okay, now I cannot emphasize this enough. We are not fighting communism at this point. Okay, every year people make the mistake, we're fighting communism. We are not fighting communism, so I'm going to put that in caps. Not fighting communism until after World War II. Okay, so please note that. Okay, one last comment here, that after in December of, December of 1917, we have the Communist Revolution, or the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And they turn into the Soviet Union, and they make a deal and leave the war shortly thereafter. Okay, So now that's the end of our discussion here. So the question is, why did the United States get involved? Well, there were a number of factors, and I would have asked you to rank them in terms of importance. Was it about the freedom of the seas? Are we going to allow Germany to dictate to us what we can and cannot do? Um, was it about national security, giving Germany too much power? Was it about our economic interests? All of these businesses were looking to profit. Was it about our perception of the Germans as barbarians? Was it a war to make the world safe for democracy against imperial powers? And really, it's some combination of both. So it's a kind of a trick question I would have asked you. Okay, and that's the end of that. And then we get into what was going on inside the United States. Okay, so I asked you to start off with the Schenck pamphlet. Remember Charles Schenck, and he was arrested, and he was saying that we're going to war just to make certain people rich, and we shouldn't do this. And he was arrested because he was interfering with the military draft. Okay, so I'm going to fix that. And he violated the Espionage Act. So they arrested him. Okay, and that's an example of our government getting very, very powerful during times of war. Okay, and so then I asked you to kind of describe what was going on the home front. In other words, what was happening. So American reaction to the war is that we have a split because some people were loyal to Britain, some people were loyal to Germany, but overall most people felt more sympathetic to the Allies. So you have things like people changing their name. They stop teaching German in school. We have like the hamburger becomes the Salisbury steak because nobody wants to, give Germany credit for inventing the hamburger. Okay, so they have a military draft, and that is called the Selective Service Act. Wow, I really messed that one up. And what else can we say? All men ages 21 to 30. So this is something that expanded the government's power. The Espionage and Sedition Acts. It made it illegal to help the enemy, give false reports, or to interfere with the war effort. Or to speak against the war publicly. And so we have our Schenck versus U.S. case, which we talked about earlier. I'm hoping you guys remember that. And Schenck was arrested for sending out those pamphlets. The government said, he was interfering with the war effort. He said this law violates my First Amendment right. And the court said that the First Amendment can be limited if your speech is going to cause a clear and present danger. And so the law was considered to be legal, and it's still around today. Okay, then we see the government involvement in the economy. So we're not practicing laissez-faire anymore. The government is going to do what it needs to do to manage the economy to win the war. So they created something called the War Industries Board, which you should know, and that coordinated production. So it told companies how much to produce. It set quotas. It moved personnel around. It said, if you manufacture pencils, now we need you to make bullets, things like that. There was something called the Fuel Administration. Which managed coal and oil use. They set up daylight savings time to save oil. They encouraged Americans to buy war bonds. What else? They took over the railroads. Okay, so we see a much bigger role of the government here in the economy, and that's something to note. Okay, and a much bigger, much more powerful government that it can limit our speech and they can issue propaganda. They had the 4-Minute Men who would go around the country and give speeches, telling people to, go sign up for the draft and grow victory gardens and save food for the troops. They would have meatless Mondays and meatless Wednesdays and things like that. Okay, so the government became much more involved and everybody was kind of pitching in. This box about the Red Scare in the 1920s. So want to point out that this is after the war. And I'm just including it in this unit because it's slightly related to this topic where people start to really fear foreigners. And with the communist revolution that took place in the Soviet Union, and they want workers of the world to unite and to take over all of the factories, it presented a threat to private property inside the United States. Okay, and so there was a man named Mitchell Palmer who was the Attorney General for the country. He went on these raids of people's homes looking for communists' involvement. And he really found very, very little evidence of anything. But it kind of shows this dislike of foreigners that has been a theme in American history, and it kind of shows its ugly head here in the 1920s. I guess I said that already, so I don't have to say that again. This fear of foreigners. Okay, so America on the home front, we all prepared. The government got much more active in the economy. The government limited dissent. And people were expected to sign up for the draft and pitch in by buying war bonds, which they called Liberty bonds. Okay, and that wraps up everything. Have a great day. I plan to do all of this for the next set of lessons that I give you. And this is what I was planning to do, just kind of post lessons, you do them, and then I'll go over them. So you can expect another video like this next week. Hang in there, guys. We're almost done. Bye.